All right, sounds good. Thank you everyone for having me, for joining the English track. My name is Pia Mancini. I'm the co-founder and CEO of OpenCollective. It's a platform I'm going to talk a little bit about later, and I'm also one of the co-founders of Sustain, a conference and series of events and podcasts and activities we organize around sustaining open source for the future. So today I'm going to talk about the economics of open source sustainability. So yeah, brace for that. Cool. So open source has a series of attributes that make it really hard to sustain financially. The first one is that it's a non-excludable public good, which means that there's no scarcity possible. The code is there for everyone to use. You cannot exclude anyone from using it. And you cannot force anyone to do anything with it. The other attribute that it has is that it has a zero marginal cost for another person to use the source code. So there is no cost for an additional user to be using the code. The code is there, one is the same. It doesn't matter if one person or 100 use it. There is no marginal cost for an extra user. So what happens with that is that, nevertheless, open source is still not free. Someone else paid for it. And the people who pay for open source are the maintainers who put their time to create that software that all of us are using to build our products. This is really tough because I'm handling two computers at the same time, so bear with me. So I don't know if you remember last year this major drama that happened when Dominic Tarr, who's maintaining about 700 NPM modules, essentially gave the keys to one of the modules to someone else who just emailed him and said, like, hey, you're maintaining 700 modules. Like, if you don't mind, I'd like to, I'm interested in this one. I want to help. I want to support. He had been doing some pull requests before. And Dominic was like, yeah, sure, look, I can't deal with anything else. It's like something I built years ago. I'm not even using it myself, right? I'm not interested in this anymore. I found another way of doing things, but sure, so go. The problem was that that person who wanted the keys to the module injected a malicious code to essentially steal Bitcoin from wallets. And so it was a catastrophe, as you can imagine. And so the whole conversation about sustaining open source kind of came back really strongly. And Dominic said, a module is like a piece of digital property. It's a right that, sure, you can transfer it. You can transfer ownership of that right, but you don't get any benefit from owning it. You cannot sell it. And you still have the responsibility, even if you're not using it anymore. So that's what he said. And someone else told Dominic, you put at risk millions of people and making something for free, but public means you are responsible for that package, right? So the situation we're in is where we have maintainers who are responsible for hundreds of packages that they created. They're not interested in them anymore because whatever, they're doing something else. But you have still thousands of people who think that you are still responsible for maintaining it, but they're not paying. You're not getting any rent or any kind of financial support for doing it. So this is what normally it's understood as like the tragedy of the commons, right? We have a common public good that everyone can benefit from, but because it's free, it's open, it's accessible, if you don't want to pay for it, you can just free write it, and that's okay. But again, the burden falls on someone. My argument is that our commons is not doomed to be depleted. We do not have to, join the pity party of the tragedy of the commons for open source, but we can successfully manage our common pool of digital infrastructure. So here are a couple of ideas on how to do that. This is economics 101, demand and supply. So marketers in general focus on the demand side of things, right? You have a company and they tell you, you invest money in getting more demand, you lower your price, you make it accessible, you make it cheap, you're gonna grow. But there's another aspect of this equation that has to do with the supply. It has to do with scarcity. So if your creations are open and accessible, if the product of your work, of your creativity, is available for anyone to use, to reproduce, to copy, to fork, to whatever, what is that is difficult, right? What is that is scarce? So for example, making something beautiful is scarce, right? But in our world, in the open source world, beauty abounds. Everything that we create, amazing technology solutions, a creative way of solving tough problems, abound for free for anyone. We just share them with one another, which is what makes our community so absolutely fantastic. So what it is in a world that beauty abounds and is shared and is accessible, what is scarce, right? How do you create scarcity? How do you create something that is both scarce and high demand in open source? And that is maintainers' time and money. And maintainers, sorry, time and access to maintainers, right? That thing that is scarce, it's our time. It's the time that we put in solving problems for other people, right? So it's true, well, it's absolutely true that there is zero marginal cost to adding a new user to the code, for using the code. That is not true for the maintainer. The more users you have, the greater the pressure on your time, the greater the issues that the number of issues that you have to solve. So this here is Mike Sharov used to work at Adobe, and he tweeted this yesterday. Says like giving money to Webpack meant access to Sean Larkin, that is one of the core contributors to Webpack, and an invaluable bundle optimization insights. Giving funding to Bubble, first via employing Henry, who's Bubble's core maintainer, but now by supporting his collective, meant that he could launch preset environment which optimized our JS payload. Right? So for Adobe, for a company, being able to have access to the time of the people that produce the code, it's super valuable, and they're willing to pay money for it. And a lot of money, like Adobe supports Bubble with a fair bit of money, and Webpack too. So, if we cannot regulate access to the code, can we regulate access to the people working on the code? If we cannot restrict our code, which of course we don't want to because it's open source, can we restrict access to the folks that are putting their time for free to maintain that code? So the Henry, the Bubble's maintainer, said it really well the other day. It's like, who's going to maintain the maintainers, right? We are all depending on these packages to create our products. We're selling those products. We're making money out of the work of other folks that are doing it for free in their free time because they're interested, because they like challenges, because they want to build great, amazing things. So the resource in this kind of strategy of the commons, or in this commons pool that gets abused, it's maintainers' time and their headspace, right? Because even if you can say, fuck you, like DH8 suggests we all should say to everyone who opens an issue, he says like, whatever. You're not paying for it, so you know what? Fuck off, I don't have to reply. First, you need to carry a fair amount of privilege to be able to say that. But also, you want to build your community. You don't want to alienate your users. You want people to use your product, to feel that, you do have a feeling of responsibility for the people who use the technology that you create. But that resource gets abused. And that's why we're seeing the level of burnout that we are seeing in our community. Folks that are just sick and tired. They're like giving up on open source because they just can't bear it anymore. So this is the problem that we are trying to solve. This is like the crux of what we're working on. And so, maybe we're looking at this wrong. Like open source is all about licenses, right? It's all about how do we protect from the consumer side, right, of things. But maybe we're looking at it wrong. We have to think about how we can protect the producers of that technology. Like, we've been thinking about it in one way, maybe went too far on that direction. So users are not free writing code, obviously. They're free writing people's time. So a couple of examples are pretty radical, but whatever. This is Fodi. Fodi is a web assembly software, and now if you want to make a pull request, you need to be a patron on their OpenCollective. Otherwise, they're like closing the pull request. Or at least they reserve the right to close anyone's pull request that it's not supporting their community financially, right? Again, I think this is a radical example, but it's really interesting that Fodi and the maintainers took the stand of saying, like, look, folks, we are creating something of value, obviously, for everyone, but it's our time that we are putting. So we would love to review your pull request. We would absolutely love to reply to your issues, but you know what? You need to give something in order for us to do it. So this is an experiment they started a couple of months ago. I don't have any data still on how it's going. And obviously, it's an honesty system. Like, you cannot exclude people from your issue tracker, right? And so they say if you do not, it's an honesty system in the sense that if you can't afford to support and you've been contributing in a different way, that's okay. We'll review the PR. We'll reply to the issue. Like, what they're trying to do here is to deal with, and we've all seen it, right? The entitled user that thinks that the open source maintainer works for him or her, usually a him. This is William Gross says, give away your code, but don't give away your time. Right? I think that this is the mentality that we need to start kind of thinking. The value that all these folks are creating, it's being captured away from their communities. Right? The value that maintainers create, sure, I get it. You have a great resume. People hire you because of your commits on GitHub. You get invited to speak in conferences, etc. So you build your personal brand. And today, personal brand is everything. We are all CEOs of our personal brands, right? I get that. But that's a very restricted also demographic. Like, not all code contributions to open source community are code. What about the ones that are doing documentation or triaging and closing issues? All of those contributions that they're harder to see, but they're still super valuable. So, I think we should sustain our community. And sustain is different from maintain. Maintain is cause or enable a condition or a state of affairs to continue. We are maintaining a source code. But sustaining is different. Sustaining implies strengthening, supporting the community, making it richer, making it more resilient. So how can we do this? How can we get rid of these community imbalances, right? Where posting an issue has zero cost today, right? Zero cost for the person who posts the issue. It has a cost on the maintainer. Companies are hooked on open source. That battle was won years ago, right? No one is now challenging open source as they were before. Like, Microsoft is certainly not calling it a cancer anymore, right? They're like full sold on open source. Yeah. More people are extracting value from a repo than the ones that are maintaining it. I'm going to show a little bit of data coming up now on that. You share the code, but you do not share the responsibility of maintaining it, of keeping it updated, etc., doing proper release candidates. It's easy to start a project. It's really difficult to leave it, right? So these community imbalances are the ones that we are trying to solve. Increasingly, open source projects have fewer maintainers and more casual contributors. This is a trend that we've been seeing, it's a bit terrifying. The buzz factor is, everyone knows what the buzz factor is, right? Like, how many maintainers need to die for the source code to be orphaned, hit by a bus. So the buzz factor is decreasing. A couple of examples. Fastlane has 900 contributors on GitHub, but 4 developers contributed 70% of all the commits in 2018. Pandas lists 1,400 contributors, but again, 4 developers contributed nearly half of the commits. And Godot had 9,471 issues open last year. 9,000, like I have 300 in my repo and I want to pull my hair out. 9,471. 2 core developers. 1 product manager. That's really tough. Like Godot is like, used by a lot of people. So we need to sustain the community as a whole and not just the individual, because maintainers come and go. Maintainers have the right of stop working on a software. They have the right to say, like, I don't want this anymore, or I'm moving to another language, or whatever. So there's this. There's more to a community than pushing patches. But not sustainable community can be specific people. Individuals live for all sorts of reasons, and a project that depends on one person to be sustainable is a project in trouble, right? And that makes sense. It's just common sense. Like, match that with the fact that now the number of maintainers for any given repo is going down. So you have a problem of coordination now. You have maintainers that have to coordinate casual contributors. That is a full-time job. That's really tough. And no one is helping them. So sustainability refers to, that is not true. They get a lot of help, but in general, the whole ecosystem is not being sustained, is what I'm trying to say. So sustainability refers to the resilience and the thriving of projects, communities, and the individuals that surround them. So this is the definition of sustainability that we came up in Sustain Open Source a couple of years ago when we did the first one in San Francisco, right? So it has to do with sustaining the community, sustaining the people inside the community, and financially sustaining that community. Those are all the elements of sustainability. It's not about one thing. It's about all of these elements together. So how do we sustain our communities? So the first thing we need is funding, right? Funding in open source is not evil. Funding in open source, if there's folks who want to make a living out of their open source work, they should be able to. That doesn't have anything to do with licensing. It doesn't have anything to do with closing the source code. It just has to do with being able to make a living doing what you love. And I want to help all of those who want to do it. So there's a couple of ways of funding open source. The first one is corporate models, right? Red Hat, OpenCore, the Linux Foundation, direct corporate funding, companies hiring developers to work on open source. Another way of funding open source is what the guys on Gitcoin or Oscoin are trying to do, that is using crypto to avoid having to deal with the legacy system. So I'll talk about this a little bit further up, but the problem that we have, one of the big problems that we have with sustaining open source, it's a problem of infrastructure, right? Think about it. Any open source project is like someone here, someone in Nebraska, someone in Ukraine, someone in Germany, right? And we have a company that wants to give them funding. What do? Where do they send the money? Who do they send the money to? A PayPal account in Ukraine? Do you really see that happen? Do you really see Google? I mean, it's tough, right? It's an infrastructure problem. So crypto solves this by using crypto and avoiding the whole conversation about. The problem is that companies don't use crypto, right? And also the other problem is that companies need an invoice. I don't know who many of you must have dealt with being a vendor of a company, that absolutely painful process of onboarding as a vendor of a company. You need to send them an invoice, a proper invoice with a tax ID of someone that they can understand is a corporation like them. You don't have that, you're not gonna get money out of the companies. So we need to solve that little problem. Another idea is open source as a public utility. We pay open source with our taxes in the same way we pay for our roads and bridges. Right? We can talk about that later. And the last one is what I do. It's a decentralized community-shaped sustainability model. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. First, corporate funding. The great thing about corporate funding is that we fund maintainers. So we fund people to work on open source, right? You hire someone to work, and it's not the 80-20 bullshit. It's like actually hiring someone to work exclusively on open source, to develop stuff for the open source project and send it back to the community. You have active contributors, which is great for your community, and you have scalability. It's easier to scale a project when it's funded by a company. The not so great things about the corporate funding is that you have a hell of a lot of governance issues. You have always this tension between commercial versus community focus, right? Okay, great. Adobe is supporting Henry to work on Babel full time, but Adobe needs the features done. Whether that's what the community wants or not, it's another discussion. But that's what they want, that's what they're paying for. And there's a threat, obviously, to the resilience and independence of the projects. So for this, we need industry standards. There has to be a standard about how corporate funding of open source is organized. Because it can very quickly go from saying to the maintainers, but what, I pay $5 a month, now you need to reply to my issue, right? And I'm gonna paste like unformatted code on a GitHub issue, and I'm expecting you to understand and fix my bug today because I'm paying, right? So there has to be an industry standard of how corporations are interacting with open source. Otherwise, this can go to hell very quickly. So what we're doing for that, we created a corporate funding index called Open Source Grants. It's a community effort, so it's not like the most sharp-looking interface, but we have year by year how much companies have been giving to open source. And this is hard cash. Like I'm not saying like, yes, my employees, 20% of their time support. No, hard cash, how much you're putting for open source sustainability. So I welcome anyone to contribute. We're gonna keep working on this, and then we're gonna build an index that is gonna be public, okay? Sorry, go back to someone who wanted to take a picture. So what are the corporate incentives to give money for things they can get for free? Right, stuff, we're talking about corporations. They think of their bottom line. First, naming the community. Open source is give, take, right? Everyone knows that. You need to give in order to take. So Microsoft understood this better than anyone. They realized that they had a very bad name in the open source community, and they're putting a lot of effort and money into reverting that. They want strategic influence on the roadmap. So this is tricky, again, because of the governance issues. But for example, Webpack, what they're doing is they have a voting system. So if you are a sponsor of the Webpack Collective, you have a certain number of gold points to vote on their roadmap application, right? Roadmap voting application. The health of your open source stack, right? If you're using, so this is less interesting or less appealing for companies in like the bottom of the pyramid, like the kind of open like operating systems and like the plumbing. But as you go up and you get to the fancy JavaScript frameworks that they change all the time and that no one knows if and how they're gonna scale, companies wanna make sure that their open source stack is healthy and that they're that the vulnerabilities are being patched, that someone is thinking strategically, that their roadmap is open, someone is thinking about a roadmap, right? So they want to make sure that they support that. Hiring and retention. Trivago, for example, the travel company out of Germany, since they started supporting Webpack, and they've been giving about $500,000, a bit less, like maybe $300 and something thousand to Webpack already. And the name they get in the community from that is huge. And now they've seen their hiring pipeline change because of that. Like developers actually telling them, we're applying to you because we know that you are an open source kind of good citizen, that you support Webpack. So this is why we're applying. You should read, there's a couple of blogs about this, but I don't know, that makes me pretty happy. Scaling of the project and obviously access. So, but we need infrastructure to support the community as a whole, as well as the individuals of that community. giving money directly to maintainers, it's okay, it's great. They have funding now, they can make a living. But as I said before, like if you do not support the community and the maintainer wants to go and do something else, you know, the community is orphaned, or the open source code is orphaned. So we need infrastructure to support the community as a community. Brooklyn, she's amazing. She works in, she developed witchcraft. And she said on a blog post that we did together and an interview, I would like to see this project outlive my personal involvement. 10 years from now, I may still be building stuff for witchcraft, but there will probably be other people interested in taking over at some point. If the funding and the collective can outlive me, that's a huge win. Everyone should really be looking to see how they can grow a community beyond themselves. And Evan, for example, said last year from Vue.js, today as the Vue community grows, there are more and more contributions from the community, and OpenCollective's transparent expense model could help us scale the financial contributions beyond a single developer. Like Vue has a little bit of an issue now, right? So Evan is really well funded himself, but the community is not scaling fast enough. And so what they wanted to do, and the reason why they opened a collective, was they wanted the community to get funded, right? Also, it's a great, like funding your community as a whole, it's also a great kind of onboarding pipeline for new maintainers to take over, right? For having new core contributors. So that's why we created OpenCollective, because we were seeing that once we started kind of talking about supporting open source and sustaining open source, and the issue of money in open source was kind of no longer an issue, and we saw companies jumping at the opportunity of giving money to these communities. Again, we had a distribution issue. Like there was nowhere to send the money. There's just no bucket where to put the money, because collectives are just groups of people, but they don't have a legal entity. And companies understand legal entities. That's all they speak. They speak corporations, right? And so we've seen collectives going through all sorts of issues. Oh, should we create a nonprofit? Where do we create? Where do we incorporate? In the United States, but there's one maintainer in the United States. Everyone else is distributed around the world, and the US is like tricky, right? Okay, let's go to Europe. Oh, VAT. Tax regulations in Europe, right? Like you need to start thinking about a lot of barriers and issues, and you need to start spending money in accountants and lawyers before you ever start making money. This just doesn't make sense. The way I see it is like having one server per blog, right? Expecting that each community has a legal entity is like having a server per blog. It's absolutely inefficient. So OpenCollective solves that problem. Right, we're creating the financial mechanism for collectives to receive money without needing their own legal entity or their own bank account. And this is why it's important. I'm convinced that many developers have no freaking idea how business actually works and what operations departments have to go through to make it happen. Enrolling as a new vendor is more than difficult, it's demoralizing. It eats souls. If you make it easy, you're God. You're laughing, I'm sure it's awful. It's awful. Going through a vendor process is awful. And imagine getting there and saying like, can you please send me, $1,200 to my PayPal account? Yeah, it's not gonna happen. We're gonna be poor forever, guys. So OpenCollective is on a mission to help our communities be sustainable. These are numbers. We are today hosting, so we have a physical host around the world that enables open source projects to just spin up a collective and start raising money in one day. And we take care of accounting, taxes, legislation, localization, you name it. It's a pain for us, but we are helping a lot of people. 1,300 collectives that we're currently hosting. These are all open source projects. 9,300 contributors, and we already contributed 3.5 million to open source. That before they couldn't have, because there was nowhere to send $3.5 million. So what else are we doing? We started Back Your Stack. So Back Your Stack is a way for any GitHub organization to scan their repositories and surface which of their dependencies are needing funding or are actively asking for funding. And we're launching, actually my team doesn't know I have this here, but we're launching a subscription model, so to back your entire stack. So we're gonna get companies to, we're gonna let them say, I'm gonna have like 100, 1,000, 10,000, whatever, a month subscription, and we're gonna distribute it across all their dependencies. So the first iteration of this is like core dependencies, and then we're going down kind of the dependency tree. As core dependencies start to get maintained, they act as beacons, and then that money kind of flows down to second level dependencies, etc. So stay tuned for more back your stack stuff. But again, it's about sustaining the whole community and not just an individual or an individual project. And this should be a no-brainer. Like if you see a company that doesn't have, which we don't have it yet, but we're gonna have a badge that says that they're supporting their entire stack, they are not good open source citizens. Just, if you can avoid working there, do not work there. Like they're not giving back to the community that is helping all of us, right? So, the other thing that that helps sustain your community is ask for help and give back, right? So we started a bounty system on OpenCollective, and the idea is to help contributors. We're working anywhere. Obviously, it's like anyone can apply to for a bounty on OpenCollective, but it's been super successful in Nigeria and Kenya because what we're doing is we're helping kind of developers onboard and do their first pull requests and then get paid for the first fixes. And then once they get paid for a $100 bounty, they can apply for a $500 bounty or a $1,500 bounty. Like we've been like really growing our community like that. And OpenCollective enabled, I'm sure you've seen this somewhere, right? JHipster do the same. Right, because of the funding that JHipster is getting on OpenCollective, they're actually able to support bounties. They're getting their contributors paid, and they closed 54 bounties already, and it works really well. They actually started this before. We modeled what we are doing on OpenCollective on what JHipster is doing. So thank you, everyone. You've been amazing. All right. More suggestions. Invest in all the people. You have money, you receive money for your open source project, invest in everyone, right? So give contributors a voice on the roadmap. There are a couple of ways of doing this. Again, the Webpack voting app is very, very useful because you can get your contributors to have a say on the roadmap. Reach out to people with different skill sets. Coding, as much as we all love it, is not the only skill that you need. In an open source community, there are other people doing other things. Think about ways to surface what they are doing. Pay for the tasks that no one wants to. Everyone is gonna say like, "Oh, this is a great problem. I'm gonna solve it. I have this, amazing new idea, and I'm gonna solve it really quickly." But there are a lot of tasks that no one wants to do, that are boring. Maintenance tasks are really boring. It's like, triaging issues, closing issues, replying to users, pointing to documentation. How many times have you pointed to, this is the place in the documentation you should be looking at? Gazillion times, right? Pay for that. Invest in face-to-face opportunities for your community. Get everyone together. It's really tough not to never met each other, right? So you can use the funding for your collective to do that. And always, always, always acknowledge all contributions. So we need to come up with a new model to distribute revenue, responsibilities, and earned social capital that takes into account different roles and supports different skill sets. This is what I'm not a fan of, the kind of GitHub model, GitHub being your resume, because it does not surface a lot of contributions that make source code and community thrive, and it's unfair. So this is the GitHub survey from, I can't remember exactly when, a couple of years ago, I think, a year and a half. So the number one thing that people encounter in open source is, guess what? Incomplete documentation. Pay for a technical writer. Hire a technical writer. Use the money from your collective to get someone to write proper docs. really, really helps. The second one, unresponsiveness. Of course, you are burnt out, you're sick and tired, you have 300 new issues a week. What are you gonna do? It's impossible to respond to all of them. There are some really cool blog posts about like the drama of going through the first issue and realizing, oh, this is really tough. If I get into this, I'm not gonna do anything else. So I'm gonna put it aside. And then you go to your second issue and on and on. So things that make your open source project, and I'm finishing now, things that make an open source project resilient and thriving do not have to do with code. Documentation, support, community engagement and advocacy, that's what I'm doing here, and community assets management too. Like, it happened that, unfortunately, maintainers have passed away. The keys to the project are nowhere to be seen, right? So we can manage the assets of our community better. We can use money for that. So what can you do? Apply and accept when possible jobs at companies that give you a portion, that give, not you, you would be great, right? That give, that give a portion of their profits to open source, right? There are companies that are actually giving a percentage of their profit, or at least a substantial amount. Get a job under, apply to those companies. If a company is a good open source citizen and you apply to work there, tell them that's the reason why. Like, do what the maintainers are doing for Trivago. Tell them, like, I'm applying here because you guys are amazing, right? In open source. If you can donate to an open source project, do it. Charge $1 per month or €1 per hour more in your consultancy fee. Give that back to open source. It doesn't make any difference to your client, any difference, right? €1, €2 more on your consultancy fee, give that to open source. We can all do it. It's easy. Now there is a way of doing it that doesn't require you finding who the maintainer is and what their PayPal address is, right? Use OpenCollective. So talk to your managers. Ask them to contribute. Pressure works. I've seen this happen over and over and over and over. We need champions in every company. Be that champion. Be that hero that is like, hey, we are using all of this open source stack, that this is making us save all of this money, this enabled us to work in this way, we need to give back. Like, it's not something that you as a developer are using, it's something that your company is benefiting from. Get them to pay. That's it, guys, thank you so much. Find me, us, OpenCollective, Pia Mancini, and Sustain Open Source, and I'll be around later to chat a bit more. Bye.